Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are at the moment and whoever you might be gathering with as we begin this Evangelise conference, which will run over the next 3 days. Well, we're now 3 months since the conclusion of the celebration stage of the Plenary Council, with the conclusion of the Second Assembly back in early July. In some ways, it still feels very close. Certainly any of us who were part of that assembly, and I know many people who were following it and keeping in touch with the experience, still have very vivid memories of the occasion and of the various interactions and events. But in other ways, we've moved on as life continues. And we've moved now into what's the implementation phase of the Plenary Council. And of course, we've moved further in the preparation stage for the Synod on Synodality, which will move towards its celebration stage, commencing its celebration stage in October next year. And then, as has been recently announced, its second assembly in October 2024. So what do we carry with us from the Plenary Council as we continue on that path as a community throughout Australia and in each of our communities? We carry 8 strong decrees with us. I think the texts are wearing well as people read them and reflect on them and start to think about how they might give rise to action. They don't yet have the force of decrees. They'll be formally confirmed and at the bishops' meeting in a couple of weeks' time, and then sent to the Holy See, where it could be up to 6 or 12 months before we hear back formally with a formal confirmation of those decrees. But they're there and readily available on the Plenary Council website, and I know that many people are accessing them, discussing them, and using them as a starting point for thinking about the sort of actions that they might undertake. The other thing that we carry with us is a renewed and strengthened commitment to a process of real discernment and synodality in the way that we engage in so many of the things that we do as a church community. And that arises out of what ended up being a very positive experience of discernment and synodality in our Plenary Council. And that goes right back to the very careful and widespread process of consultation and preparation, which drew in over 220,000 people from around Australia, and the various rounds of consultation and development of documents that occurred during that. And then also, of course, in the Assembly itself, particularly the Second Assembly, also in the First Assembly last October, which was also characterised very much by that process of spiritual conversations. But that was even more tangible, I think, in the Second Assembly, which not only continued the practice of spiritual conversations on table groups rather than screen groups, which was a very welcome improvement, but also needed to have a process where we could move towards actually taking decisions rather than just reflecting on issues that might move us towards decisions. So thinking about each of those, first of all, the decrees and this time of implementation. 5 suggestions I'd make about those. Because even though they don't yet have the force of decrees, there are an enormous range of things that can be picked up and acted on without needing the actual authorization of a decree as such. many of the things that are set out in the decrees are already permitted and provided for. So, for instance, in this diocese, we're in the middle of a 12-month process of consultation and preparation, which will lead to the establishing of a diocesan pastoral council. We believe it's really important not only to actually make a decision to have a pastoral council in the diocese, but also to ensure that the way that it's set up is synodal. So not just the council itself operates synodally, but the way that we set it up is synodal. So we had some time ago the report from a review on diocesan structures, and earlier this year we commenced a formal process of consulting with each of the communities in our diocese, in our parishes, in our secondary schools, to reflect on and hear from people about things like how we might go about selecting members for the council, how its agenda and the things that it looks at might arise and might be considered, and what its decision-making processes might be. That's the sort of thing that can happen in any diocese and indeed in any parish, with the renewed emphasis in one of the decrees from the Plenary Council about the importance and value of both diocesan pastoral councils and of parish pastoral councils. There's a commitment that has been made by the bishops of Australia that in each diocese of the country there will be a diocesan synod within 5 years of the conclusion of the Plenary Council. That commitment had been made prior to the Second Assembly, and I know in many dioceses there are already preparations underway to begin preparations for that, for those synods, which will be, I know in many cases, one of the key ways that as a diocesan community, those places reflect on the process of the Plenary Council and the outcomes of the Plenary Council in order to decide how to act on them locally. Thirdly, there's been a decision in one of the decrees for beginning a process of establishing a national synodal roundtable. None of us are completely sure what that might look like at this stage. And that process of beginning to have a process of discussing that, considering what sort of factors we might take into account, that can certainly commence, and that would be a constructive thing. Fourthly, there's a commitment that all parishes and Catholic entities join the Laudato Si action plan, the Laudato Si platform, and develop a Laudato Si action platform. Develop an Laudato Si action plan. Lots of terminology to learn in dealing with all of this, but it's about very helpful vehicles for collaborating and having a structure to implement the commitment that was so evident at the Plenary Council and in the consultations leading up to it, to ensure that we are a people who are committed to integral ecology in our community and to building that up in our world. And a fifth suggestion is the commitment that was emphasised in the Plenary Council of supporting and working to encourage efforts to implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Again, something that in many communities is already happening and can continue to happen. And there are many other things like those in the decrees of the Council, which could be picked up now in parishes, in schools, in dioceses, and so on. Then, thinking about the experience of the Plenary Council and what we might pick up from there, not just from the decrees, how we might learn to use those same sort of processes and insights in both our existing structures and as we continue this broader process that Pope Francis has invited us into in preparing for the Synod on Synodality. I know many of those who were at the Plenary Council went back to their home communities, really keen to ensure that in the various bodies and decision-making entities that they were part of, in parishes, dioceses, school boards and so on, religious communities, that the same sort of discerning commitment to discernment that was in the Plenary Council would be something they would draw on. So one of the ways of doing that is to ensure that the context for decision making and discussion is prayer. We don't just have a prayer at the beginning, get it out of the way, and then go on to the real business. Part of our real business is how we respond prayerfully and reflectively to our experience of God, particularly to the Word of God. And so building that into the structures that we use, it really changes not just the context, but it also changes the question. Instead of being, what is it that we can agree on, or who has the strongest argument, it becomes more, what is God asking of us? What are we called to? And that changes the whole context, and it changes the way that we consider the questions and the sort of responses that we end up making. We can ensure that some of the elements that were so much a part of the Plenary Council process are part and were so valued in that process continue to be part of our processes. So the emphasis on participation, on co-responsibility, on consultation, on involvement in the decision-making process. All of those things we hear Pope Francis talk about again and again in reflecting on what it means not just to have synods or to have councils, but to act synodally, to have synodality as a characteristic of the way that we live as church. One of the things that Pope Francis reminds us of particularly helpfully is to ensure that when we're thinking about participation and consultation and involvement, that's not just of people who have loud voices and are readily able to participate, but that it's especially of groups and people who might have been overlooked. So, for instance, women who have often had an experience of feeling like they were overlooked, or of young people, other people who feel excluded. Another aspect of that sort of co-responsibility and consultation is ensuring that we keep on building in a circular process in consulting, in feeding back about that consultation, and in formulating decisions. It's very interesting that there's about to be published a document that responds at a global scale to the various national syntheses leading to the synod, before we go on to prepare the continental documents, which will happen in early next year. So there's feedback and response, a circular process. So a few things I think we learnt about synodality from moving through our Plenary Council experience, and particularly the difficult moments of that experience, to come to a point where we had, I think, what people have found to be a really successful outcome. One of those about speaking, one of them about listening. I think we learnt how important it is to speak courageously. And courageously, not just boldly and loudly, but to speak in a way that exposes ourselves. One of the things I think in hindsight, as I look back and have heard other people speak, is that one of the shifts that happened in the Council's Second Assembly was that we moved from talking from our heads to talking more from our hearts, to speaking from our hearts. And that changes what's said. And it changed also the way that people listened to one another. People listened in a way that was open to conversion, a humble listening, if you like, a listening that was listening from the heart, rather than listening with an intellectual response. What might I say in response to this? Oh, I've heard that argument before. I know what that says, and I know what the answer is to that. Responding from the heart. What do I hear in my heart? Responding in a way that is open to learning. Pope Francis keeps talking about dialogue as being characterised by learning. A learning that means that we're ready to let go. If we learn, if we're open to conversion, that means that we're prepared to step away from something that we hold on to. That can be costly. That was certainly costly in the Second Assembly of the Plenary Council. And people were prepared to undertake that cost and had that commitment. And I think what we saw is that the content in the things we were discussing didn't change very much in terms of the final documents that we approved. But what did change very significantly was the extent to which people felt heard and to which people felt that that their views had been appreciated, and the extent to which people did actually appreciate the views that were different from theirs. So we entered into a real process of dialogue. One of the things about dialogue, and again that we learnt in the process of the Plenary Council, was not rushing to an end point, being prepared to take the time that's needed to continue a decision-making process, to continue the discerning until it's clear that there is a way forward that has consensus. And that's certainly part of what we did in the much more in the second part of the Assembly. One of the things that I've been thinking about, particularly in that context, is the role of voting in the final stage of decision making. Clearly, there needs to be an end point at which a decision is set. And in a group, one of the ways of doing that is in voting. But it's the sort of thing that isn't something I think to overuse. So we were using lots of indications and cards and things, and there's other sorts of processes that we can use in moving towards a consensus to avoid ending up in a situation where a vote marks out simply yes and no, an adversarial situation where perhaps the winner can take all, where we risk that those who disagree, those who might be on the periphery, those who might be the minority, are marginalised. I think it's particularly problematic if we end up with a situation in any sort of decision making where it's sort of 51-49. That says that we're really not ready for a vote. We're really not ready to conclude the decision making, the discerning. So what's the goal of all of that? And I think it's important to remember that there is a goal. The goal is not just having good process. The goal is ultimately what we're reminded of in the title of this conference. The goal is about evangelizing. And again, Pope Francis reminds us again and again that synodality is about renewing who we are as a people on the way, a people who have a mission. We need to be oriented towards a mission. We need to have a direction, not just a process. We're on the way towards God's kingdom and building up God's kingdom. Again and again in the way that the questions for our plenary council were focused, we were asked, how can we make the church in Australia more Christ-centred and missionary? This is not just for having good process, it's for renewing ourselves and being more missionary, as Christ-centred and missionary. So that having spoken from our hearts and listened with our hearts, spoken using our heads also, of course, using reason and reflection, but moving to engage our hearts, we can eventually also respond with our hands and with our feet.
So our panel tonight is Ruth Lawler, who's a member of the Sacred Heart Parish Cathedral community and is also Sandhurst Youth Ministry Coordinator. Welcome, Ruth.
Thanks, Chris.
We also have Astrid Notarangelo, Astrid is a parishioner at St Killian's here in Bendigo and is also pastoral associate at St Joseph's in Quarry Hill and St Monica's at Kangaroo Flat. And we also have Father Junrei, who is the administrator at St Killian's here in Bendigo. Welcome, Astrid. Welcome, Junrei. Welcome to all of our panellists. We also have Bishop Shane joining us as a panellist. We've charged Bishop Shane with the role of listening whilst we have a conversation, and then we'll invite Bishop Shane at the end to offer some reflective comments. So our opening question is the same one that we've just all reflected on, and I'll begin with you, Ruth. What stood out for you from Bishop Shane's keynote address tonight?
For me, listening to Bishop Shane, and while I had your notes previous, I hadn't really thought about it in great detail, but it just kept coming back, this idea of go forth. And I think that's very much on my mind at the moment as we're involved in the consultation stages for this mission and pastoral council. But I think, to quote Pope Francis, a church which goes forth is a church whose doors are open. For me, the Plenary Council was this moment of doors opening. I feel that I went in to the Plenary Council as a member. I felt a bit of fear that maybe some doors would close with the decrees that came out. But I actually feel the more I sit with it, the more I've read and the more I took part in the listening and dialogue, that a lot of doors were open. I'm not sure where those doors are going to lead, but those doors are now open. And that's where listening to you today has taken my thoughts. So yeah.
Thanks, Ruth. And so we'll give each panellist a turn to respond to that. What stood out for you, Astrid?
I think I was really heartened to hear that sort of a fresh awareness of the equal importance of process with the decisions that are made, and that fills me with hope. And also that sense of circularity is I think really positive. The other thing that I heard as you were speaking, that title of launching into the deep, and the sense that we need to meet each other more frequently and also with new eyes. And that as it was, I didn't attend the Plenary Council, but as it was at the council, it seems that there were some difficult moments, and that we will experience that as we move this out into the community, that we've got to be prepared to be uncomfortable and to really meet others. And even that moment that you talked about, when there was a crisis, as a Catholic woman in Kangaroo Flat in the garden one day listening in, that was the moment where I felt connected to what was happening. That sense of, this is actually really addressing something that I find in my life. And so I think there's hope in those difficult moments, that we shouldn't be afraid to step into them, because as you were saying, Ruth, like it can open doors as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Astrid. And Father Junrei, what stood out for you?
I think what really stood out for me is the whole process of synod and listening. Because I think for ages, I think the whole decision making is much more of the hierarchy, but here the whole listening is an attempt to listen to the voice of every member of the church, not only about who's loudest voice, but also even those voices who are overlooked, or even voices that even are really gone in the church. And I think it's a really good reflection. It is a way of ongoing conversion in the church, that why people of the faith leave the church, and it is a difficult path, but it's also a humbling path for the church. And I think the whole process of synodal, especially about the decision making, I think for me, I'll be turning 7 years this Sunday as a priest, but I rely so much on the voices and the wisdom of the lay, and because the church is the people of God, and I'm part of that. Yeah.
Thank you, Father Junrei. Each of you in your own way have mentioned that idea of being synodal, that moving from synod to something we have, to synodal as a way of being. And each of you, I think, have talked about the importance of that. Perhaps we could hear from each of you about a concrete example of where you're seeing that. We heard from Bishop Shane about the processes that we're undertaking here in this diocese to establish a pastoral council for our diocese as using that. But I'm interested in hearing from each of you. So perhaps Astrid, is there something you could speak to in your experience?
Thank you, Chris. Actually, an experience from today just comes to mind, so I think I'll focus on that. So the experience was, as a newly appointed pastoral associate in a particular parish, we had a meeting with our liturgy group today, and part of the conversation, as we began to sort of expand our creativity and sense of what we might be able to achieve, what came into the conversation was some of the material from the Plenary Council about, well, we should have a parish council, so that was feeding into our practical discussion about what we hoped to move forward into. So I think that was a good example of how it can actually just be brought. It felt very natural to bring that in. So, yeah.
A very concrete experience there. Yeah. Father Junray, something that strikes you?
Yeah, I think for me, I have to speak also with my background. I come from a country where, from the Philippines, where we treat our priests, it's like almost like kings and next to God. And when it comes to decision making, I think there's so much abuse with clericalism, and there's no space for the voices of ordinary people in the slums or the barrios, and we've seen how people really hurt with that. And I think with coming from that background and as a young priest, I had to go back how whenever we like setting a finance council, from a male dominated to inclusivity, or also of PPC as well. And we're very conscious now, and I think that's how the whole process of Pope Francis putting to the table, like, if the church is not a synodal, it's not a church.
I think something that I'm hearing you say is it's something you have to practice, something you learn it by doing it, not about reading about it or watching. You actually have to have a go. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Father John Ray. And Ruth, something that's that synodal way. That's
look, Chris, you and I have both been journeying around the diocese, as Bishop Shane was speaking about earlier, as part of this consultation and preparation for the Mission and Pastoral Council. It's a privilege to be able to do that. And what I'm really loving, it's this cyclic nature of myself and Chris, with your role at the Plenary Council as facilitator as well. We're able to share our experiences there and then help people move on to the next step where we're able to hear back from them again. And I'm really loving this give and take, in a way, of us sharing and hearing and offering up different things, but also hearing the privilege of hearing people's great hope for the church in our parishes, but also their great sorrows, because I think a lot of synodality is acknowledging and this hurt that we're all carrying, whether that is, and the hope as well that comes with that, but whether we're just hurting over something small, or which can look small from the outside but is rather large for the individual, or whether it is a large church Australia-wide or global issue with the church. I think this synodality is in action of just us going out and listening. But sorry to keep going, but this experience of Marion College, and I'll name Marion College and Myrtleford. Shout out to Marion. Yep. if you're watching. But we were there during the week, or last week, the week before.
Last week.
It all blends. Yeah. And one of the responses we got from students as we consulted about this was, why did you come to us? We're such a small school. And my response to them was, your voice is just as important as anyone in any of the larger schools or the larger parishes. And it was this moment of, this is really important, what we're doing, the big, the small, the hopes, the sorrows, everything. Yeah.
Thanks, Ruth. I'd be interested, each of you, and perhaps Ruth in particular, you've tapped into some of that, where the gaps are, where it's not quite there, where people are experiencing some pain or some loss. Would any of you, I'm just going to open it up now, would any of you like to talk about, where you perceive, either at a parish level or at a diocesan level, where there are some gaps that we could, really move into, where there is pain or loss? Take a moment.
Very, very briefly, I suppose, one of the areas that didn't come up much or as much at the Plenary Council, and I think I speak as coordinator of youth ministry, this area of young people and reaching young people is something really close to my heart, and something I think we've got a lot of opportunity there. But there's maybe too much opportunity, and narrowing our focus. We talk about this all the time, is there's so much we can do, but how do we really narrow it in? I'm looking, as an example of that, is how can we have a voice to a pastoral council, mission and pastoral council for the diocese, that maybe young people can be a voice to it, even if for whatever reason, accessibility issues, they can't be a member. How can we have a voice for them so that their voices are heard at that level?
And if I could just comment there too on our diocesan synthesis for the Synod on synodality, one of the yearnings from people in parishes was connection with families, young families in particular, and that bridging the gap, perhaps, if there is a gap between school and parish. And that's something that came through over and over again as both a pain, but also a hope that people had. Anyone else?
Yeah, a couple of things come to mind. So I think there's three as we're all speaking. So something's about passing on the banner of faith, that pain, which is like an intergenerational kind of pain, as far as, and like you say, there's hope as well. But, and in that, so recognising as we move forward, what are the things that are generational or cultural about our faith? And what are the things that we have in common, so that in that space we can kind of hold with love everybody that has differing views, but still move forward together. So the intergenerational, I was thinking also in that area of honouring, the vastly different cultures and the rapid diversification that we see in Western countries through our expression. So obviously we want to retain the sacred liturgical tradition. I'm thinking of music in particular here, but also that honouring of cultural difference, and in particular Indigenous Catholicism, and how do we connect more? We have Reconciliation Week, and we put, we try to recognise that by putting information on PowerPoint slides, but just really engaging more, like can we as guests and in humility connect with Indigenous Catholic services, that sort of thinking about connecting. Yeah.
Moving beyond the symbolic to actually, really confronting and being truly inclusive. Yeah. Thank you. And Father John Ray, anything for you where you see gaps? Or?
I think I'll just build up to the conversation. First one would be, especially my experience as from the other country, I think we've seen a number of communities who are quite enriched by the different cultures, and I think I try to really engage them to be part of PPC, but they're very very scared at the moment, I think for me is to really empower also the voices of the immigrants and the refugees, because they are around and they are enriching communities around around Australia, around our churches, and I think the very favorite words of Pope Francis are nearness, joy, proximity, and I think that's I think slowly we just find ways how to reach out to them. Another probably the gaps might be it's to the young people. I think the young people these days are totally different concept of community, and probably we might get engaged more of online communities, because that's especially the Generation Z or millennials. So like their concept of community is not this like physical community, but it's also of online community. So probably much more evangelization too in the online community. So.
Thank you. And I might just press the pause button on our conversation and invite Bishop Shane now to perhaps offer some reflections on what you've heard.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks to each of you. It's been a very rich conversation, and it's lovely to be reminded of how rich the life of our communities are, how much there is to draw on. It struck me how important it is to take the time that's needed for that richness, for those many voices to be heard, especially the voices that perhaps are not going to be heard at the front of the queue. The voices even that, as you were pointing to, Junrang, we need to go and seek out, even if they're as far away, even as Myrtleford, or wherever they might be, wherever the Myrtleford might be. And to be open to the possibility that they're not going to be voices that say what we want to hear, that there's difficult stories and painful experiences, but that pain, and this was, as I thought about what a couple of you said about pain, this was the experience in the difficult moments of the Plenary Council. In fact, there are ways of engaging with that which open new doors. So pain and hope, perhaps I'm hearing as connected. I don't know, two sides of the same coin might be too simple, but two aspects of a broader reality. So part of the way that we respond to pain can open up pathways of hope. And certainly that's part of what's needed in an experience of pain, an experience of being especially left aside and not listened to, is of having a door opened, of having a way to go forward. And I think that was one of the things I've heard since the conclusion of the Plenary Council, is how encouraged so many people are by having some tools and some assistance in thinking about how we might move forward, how we might go through some of those doors or open some other doors that you talked about, Ruth. And all of that, whenever we're talking about movement, whenever we're talking about going somewhere, that again brings us full circle back to mission, back to living out our call to be missionary disciples. That what we're doing is responding to the gospel, seeking to build up God's kingdom, and seeking to be communities that enrich our world in the way that we do that, responding and building up God's kingdom in the way ultimately that we are committed to evangelise.
Thanks, Bishop Shane. And we do have a little bit of time. So if there is anything, as you've listened to Bishop Shane offer his reflections, if there's something else that struck you that you'd like to speak about, please speak into the space.
I think one of the things is this whole moving forward, this whole mission approach. It is a global focus of the church at the moment. We can see in what Pope Francis is talking about regularly. The World Youth Day theme for this year and next year is Mary arose and went with haste. And when he spoke at the World Grandparents and Elderly Day, he spoke about the same thing of, in that same way of, your role as an older person is not to sit back and let life happen around you. It is to still be part of the world. And I think for me, there's all this hope in that we're talking about these things, but Pope Francis is also feeding right into that. And I take a lot of that with me, that this intergenerational thing as well, not just World Youth Day, not just for grandparents and elderly, but it's across everything he's talking about. And that's something I hope we can can really take with us going forward.
I know one of the words that you often refer to, Ruth, and comes up time and time again with Pope Francis, particularly in his writings to young people, is being a protagonist. And he uses some really striking images like get off the couch, don't sit on the bench, have your boots laced, ready to go. And that's something that, you know, I'm hearing you resonate now with. It's not just young people, this is all of us. So this co-responsibility we have for mission. So yeah, thank you. Anyone else like to offer something in there?
Just something that came to mind as you were speaking then, Ruth, was just around intergenerational, around seeing each other with new eyes, and also some of the models and in the church itself. So I'm just thinking Mary came to mind, and just our perception and our depictions of Mary, often as a young woman, but as someone in their mature years. Mary lived to be as old as me or older, and that sense of her as an adventurer, as someone who was a leader, as someone who was a disciple. Just seeing out some of our key the key characters of our faith with new eyes also. Yeah.
Thanks, Astrid. And Father John Ray, would you like to offer anything else?
I think, I think the sense of hope to all of this, and the plenary and the synod, and on synodality, I think just a lot of hope to the church, and encouraging voices around. But I just always love the image of Pope Francis, we don't want a tired church. And this is just a really encouraging way to revitalize the energy of the church.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our panellists tonight. It's been a really rich and engaging conversation. And thank you, Father Jean Ray. Yeah. Thank you, Astrid. Thank you, Ruth. And of course, Bishop Shane. Thank you.